The murder of Emma Elizabeth Smith. The 2nd of April 1888 was the Easter Bank Holiday Monday, albeit the weather that day was not particularly conducive to outdoor pursuits. As one newspaper put it in its next day's edition, the weather in London yesterday was very unfavourable for holiday making. Though dull, the morning was dry, and many thousands were tempted abroad in the hope that the rain would hold off. In this they were disappointed, for at noon heavy rain showers fell and rendered those in the streets damp and uncomfortable. As a consequence, all indoor places of resort and amusement became thronged, in some cases to an uncomfortable extent, while the welcome shelter of the taverns appeared to also be taken advantage of to an unusual extent. On the Monday evening, at the common lodging-house at 18 George Street, Spitalfields, at which she had been a resident for 18 months, Emma Elizabeth Smith, a 45-year-old widow, readied herself for a night out. Emma was what was referred to at the time as an unfortunate, one of the lowest classes of prostitute that plied their trade on the streets and who conducted their business in any dark corner of any of the squares, balconies, alleyways, passages, or even in the backyards of the houses of the district. It was a dangerous business, and Emma, so the deputy keeper of the lodging-house, Mary Russell, later recalled, had often come home with black eyes that men had given her. And on one occasion she had even returned home and told Mary that she had been thrown out of a window. Like many of the unfortunates in the Victorian East End, alcoholism was at the root of Emma's misfortunes. Indeed, Mary Russell would later state that when she had had a drink, Emma acted like a madwoman. Recalling her in his memoir, I Caught Crippen, written 50 or so years later, former East End police officer Walter Dew had this to say about poor Emma Smith. Emma, a woman of more than 40, was something of a mystery. Her past was a closed book, even to her most intimate friends. All that she had ever told anyone about herself was that she was a widow who more than 10 years before had left her husband and had broken away from all her early associations. There was something about Emma Smith which suggested that there had been a time when the comforts of life had not been denied her. There was a touch of culture in her speech, unusual in her class. Once, when Emma was asked why she had broken away so completely from her old life, she replied, a little wistfully, "They would not understand now any more than they understood then. I must live somehow." So, more lonely even than most of her fellows, she walked the streets of Whitechapel. However, when she left 18 George Street on the evening of the Bank Holiday Monday, Emma was, according to Mary Russell, apparently in good health. It was never established what Emma Smith did or where she went after she left the lodging-house on that Monday evening. It is probable that, like many Londoners that night, she spent some of her time drinking in one of the area's many pubs. At a quarter after midnight on the morning of Tuesday, the 3rd of April, 1888, Margaret Hayes, a fellow lodger at 18 George Street, saw Emma talking with a man who was wearing dark clothing and who was sporting a white neckerchief. Margaret Hayes had herself just been assaulted by 2 men, one of whom had stopped her and asked her for the time, whereupon the other had punched her in the mouth. The 2 men had then fled into the night. Later stating that there had been some rough work that night, Margaret decided to head home, and as she was passing Farrant Street, Burdett Road, she noticed Emma and the man talking together. She was, so she later testified, certain that the man was not one of the 2 that had attacked her. Margaret would also say later that the quarter was a fearfully rough one, and that just before Christmas 1887 she herself had been injured by men under circumstances of a similar nature, and had had to spend a fortnight in the infirmary as a result. Given her own recent and past experiences, Margaret was not inclined to hang around, and so she continued with her journey and headed back to the lodging-house in George Street, leaving Emma talking with the man. Between 4 and 5 o'clock that morning, Emma Smith returned to 18 George Street, where Mary Russell became immediately concerned at the state she was in. Her face was bleeding, Mary later recalled. Her ear was badly cut, and she said that she was also injured about the lower part of the body. Emma told Mary that she had been shockingly maltreated by some men as she was making her way along Osborn Street. Her assailants, she said, had robbed her of all her money. Although she could not describe her attackers, she did say that the youngest was aged about 19. Mary was extremely concerned about the injuries that her lodger had received and the evident pain and discomfort that she was obviously in, and she tried to persuade Emma to go with her to the nearby London hospital. However, Emma was reluctant to do so. Mary, though, persevered, and Emma finally gave in, and, accompanied by fellow lodgers Margaret Hayes and Annie Lee, they set off for the 15 or so minutes' walk to the nearby London hospital on Whitechapel Road. As they passed along Osborn Street, Emma pointed to a spot near Taylor's cocoa factory and stated that that was the location where the outrage against her had been perpetrated. On arrival at the London hospital, Emma Smith was seen by Dr. George Haslip, the house surgeon. He later testified that, although she had probably been drinking, she was not intoxicated and she knew what she was about. On examining her, he found that the injuries she had suffered were truly horrific. A portion of the right ear was torn, and the peritoneum and other internal organs had been ruptured, which, he later stated, led him to believe that the injuries had been caused by some blunt instrument having been thrust into her with very great force. He asked her how she had come by the injuries, to which she replied that she had been walking past Whitechapel Church at about 1:30 on Tuesday morning when she saw some men approaching. She had crossed over the road to avoid them, but they had proceeded to follow her along Osborn Street, where they assaulted her, robbed her of all the money she had, and then committed the outrage. There were, she told the doctor, 2 or 3 men, one of them looking like a youth of about 19. She was, Haslip later stated, somewhat reticent with regard to the details, but she distinctly denied having addressed the men in solicitation. She could not tell whether it was a knife or what instrument it was that had been used on her. She also told him that she was originally from the country, but that she had not seen her friends or family for 10 years. Emma's injuries proved to be extremely serious, and it wasn't long before peritonitis had set in, and, having sunk into a coma, she died at 9 o'clock on the morning of Wednesday, the 4th of April, 1888. It is often stated that the press paid little heed to the fate of Emma Smith. This is simply not true. Indeed, newspapers across the country were genuinely shocked by what had occurred, and they reported the story under such lurid headlines as "The Horrible Outrage in Whitechapel," "Murder by Whitechapel Roughs," "Brutal Murder in Whitechapel," "Barbarous Outrage in the East End of London," and "Shocking Murder of a Widow." The Worcestershire Chronicle on Saturday the 14th of April 1888 looked back on what was seen as the tragedy of the depths of degradation to which Emma Elizabeth Smith, and to which hundreds like her in the district where her murder had occurred, had sunk. Seldom has a more hideously sordid story of a woman's career been unrolled than was that of Emma Smith. Robbed, outraged, and wounded unto death under circumstances of exceptional brutality by a gang of ruffians while she was staggering home the worse for drink down a by-street between Whitechapel and Spitalfields after a bank holiday spree. It was a terrible end to a terrible life. The home was a common 4-penny lodging house. She had not corresponded with nor seen a relation for 10 years. It seems scarcely possible to believe that a woman could fall to such depths of degradation, and yet she is no more than a typical example of those who patronize the foul haunts of these fearful houses where drinking, fighting, and all other loathsome vices are the pastime of the poor wretches who can raise 2 shillings a week for the accommodation they get within their fetid walls. The inquest into Emma Smith's death was held at the London Hospital on Saturday, the 7th of April, 1888. Few people could disagree with the coroner, Mr. Wynne Edwin Baxter, when, during his summing up, he decreed that the woman had been barbarously murdered, and opined that it was impossible to imagine a more brutal and dastardly assault. The jury willingly followed his instruction that they should bring in an immediate verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown. Emma Smith probably wasn't a victim of Jack the Ripper. Indeed, the fact that she was able to tell the attending doctor that she had been attacked by a group of men suggests that she was in fact the victim of one of the local gangs that preyed upon the district's prostitutes. This was evidently the conclusion that the police came to at the time, and this belief would influence their line of inquiry in the early days of the hunt for Jack the Ripper. But the death of Emma Elizabeth Smith was significant in one major respect. For it was with her death that the police opened a file which they titled the Whitechapel Murder File, and by the end of 1888 that file had become the Whitechapel Murders File, and it had on it the 5 acknowledged victims of Jack the Ripper.